Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment, but in the past everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently. All right. Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier. Whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that. And eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now, fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right, and this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load. These machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So, for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands machines, and it's going to, you know, authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now, the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it, and that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, the DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day where, you know, every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, Group Policy Objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, you know, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So, I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO, but what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate, so when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines, authenticate with which domain controller. All right, so these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful, a very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here. All right, and of course you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular by Microsoft on premise. So here you've got these these four servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here, make a little bit of room here, and I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right, So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'm gonna give him a frowny face, and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's gonna be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right. And so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator, and basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RRAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about people getting allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right, and so now what you would do is you'd only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker, somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power, but here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL, and when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody. It's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's a small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that that can expand across multiple machines across the board in these big data centers. But not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is. And with that is really where, cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section, we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. So with the creation of virtualization, it got companies thinking. Companies like Amazon and Google and Intel and IBM and eventually even Microsoft that, hey, we've got these massive data centers. Why not allow people to pay us to host their virtual machines on our data center? So in other words, we can get people to pay us money to host their virtual machines, and they don't have to deal with all the headaches of dealing with everything on premise. So this is really the idea of where cloud services came from. And so I'm going to draw this kind of big cloud here. This is going to represent cloud computing, if you will, and we'll have a connection coming down here, okay? And I will just kind of clean that up a little bit, make it somewhat look nice. So this being, the big thing is this is not a new concept of, if you think about humans as a whole, we have offered services for years. I know how to change the oil in my car, but I don't necessarily enjoy doing it. So I can pay a mechanic shop the fee, and they will do it for me as a service, right? Well, this is the idea of cloud services. So there's some acronyms I want to introduce you to. The first one being the term IaaS, and that is infrastructure as a service. So infrastructure as a service means the cloud provider is offering their infrastructure for a fee as a service, okay? So the idea being something like this: instead of me having to host my virtual machines and all that in my on-premise environment, I can pay this cloud company to host virtual machines for me. They can also host a virtual network for you. They can host, they can have storage that's offered to you. They can have firewalls, virtual firewalls that are associated on those virtual networks, and virtual load balancers. Okay, they can have apps out there that are available. They can have virtual databases that are hosted in the cloud. So essentially just about anything you could imagine that you can host on premise can be hosted out there in the cloud service. Now, Amazon, Google, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, these various companies offer this. Microsoft's cloud service that does this, their IaaS service is called Azure. Now, let me just kind of clarify. You may pronounce that name, that word, a little different than I do, Azure or Azure or Azure. Actually, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I actually went to the internet and started watching videos of the developers that created Azure, and the first few developers that I watched, that's how they pronounced it. They pronounced it Azure. So that's how I just assumed that it needed to be pronounced. Of course, I learned later down the road that not all the developers even agree on how to pronounce that word. Some of them pronounced it Azure, Azure, Azure. I've even heard somebody pronounce it Azure. So this is one of those tomato, pronounce that word any way you want to pronounce it. That's how I say it, which is Azure, okay? So Azure is Microsoft's official infrastructure as a service. And the way that it all works is you pay a fee for what you use every month. Basically, how much CPU, memory, storage, network, all of that you use, that's what you're going to pay for. Okay. Now, there are some other terms, other acronyms that I want to introduce you to. There is an acronym called PaaS, which stands for Platform as a Service, and an acronym called SaaS, which is Software as a Service. Now, the idea there being that there are, well, we'll start with Software as a Service first. Software as a service, the idea is that there is a fully functional app or application that is 100% ready for you to start using, or your users to start using. All you got to do is just jump right in and start using it. Okay, so there are some Azure services that are software as a service. There's also what are called platforms as a service. Now, platform as a service is kind of there's a little bit more work involved from an admin standpoint. So a platform as a service means there is some type of software platform that is available for you to start using, and it's 100% ready for you to use, but you have to go and administer it and use it before it's going to really do anything. A good example of this is Microsoft's directory services in the cloud is called Entra ID. Entra ID. All right. Which I want to make, it's very important that you realize that this was formerly called Azure AD, and there's still a lot of documentation out there that refers to this as Azure AD. So it's very important that that you are aware of that. Now, you are taking my course right now, and you should realize that I have hundreds of hours of videos that I've got to update that involve that term Azure AD. There are literally hundreds of hours that I have recorded using the term Azure AD, and I'm in the process of updating videos, but be aware that I don't have them all upgraded. So you may hear me refer in the course to stuff as Azure AD. I actually have a video on this for you to watch after these foundation videos. It's a video that says do not skip. So please do not skip that video. Make sure you watch that video because it's going to talk about this name change. So anyway, the name is now Entra ID. It's just a name change. They changed it to Azure AD. The services are pretty much all the same. It's just a name change. Okay, so Entra ID is a platform as a service. Now, it is Microsoft's directory services. This is where your user accounts and passwords and groups and permissions, role permissions, and all that are all managed through Entra ID, formerly Azure AD. Okay, whereas on-premise in a domain, we called it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. All right, and I think that's part of the reason Microsoft changed the name, to kind of distinguish the difference between the on-premise Active Directory and the former Active Directory, Azure AD, to Entra ID. Anyway, this platform as a service is ready for you to use, but there's only like one user, and that's the admin, and then you're responsible for going in there as an admin and adding users and controlling things. That's why it's a platform as a service. It's not 100% ready, set up. You have to administer it. Now, Microsoft's main platform as a service functions and software as a service, they have something called Microsoft 365. So there's really two parts to the Microsoft Cloud Service. There's Azure, which is mostly focused on the IaaS side of things. And don't get me wrong, in Azure there are also some platform as a services and software as a services, but it's mostly geared towards IaaS. Whereas Microsoft 365 is mostly geared towards platform as a service. Now, these two are very related. Microsoft 365 sits on top of Azure. You can't have Microsoft 365 without Azure. And if you create an Azure account, then it'll allow you to automatically create a Microsoft 365 account. So these are all related. You're not just going to create an Azure account or not just going to create a Microsoft 365 account. They're pretty much linked together. Okay. Now, in the Microsoft 365 services, you have lots of platform as a services and software as a service. For example, we have what are called the Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise, which that was formerly called Office 365, and that's the downloadable version of the Microsoft 365 apps, formerly the Office 365 apps like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all of that. And there is also something called Office for the Web. Now that is fully a software as a service. The Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise, that is actually a mix. It's a platform as a service and a software as a service. Most people refer to it as a software as a service because they're downloadable apps. But as an admin, from an admin standpoint, we have to administer that. So the administration side of it is platform as a service. Office for the Web is 100% software as a service. These are web-based versions of the Office apps that are ready for your users to use. Once they get a license, they can use it. Okay, then we have Exchange Online. Okay, so the administration side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service, right? And then we've got SharePoint Online, which is the same idea. It's a, admin side is a platform as a service, but the user side, which is what most everybody focuses on, is a software as a service. We have Microsoft Teams, same thing for that. Okay, for messaging and all of that fun stuff. We have a product called Intune, which is an incredibly powerful product. Mobile device management, mobile application management. Intune is what is sort of taking the place of GPOs in the cloud. So on premise, we could control the settings and parameters and attributes, and we could deploy software and all that using GPOs on premise. Well, now when it comes to the cloud service, we can use Intune. We can actually control on-premise machines from Intune. So it is very, very powerful, an incredibly powerful product. Then we've got OneDrive for Business. OneDrive for Business is a cloud-based storage that users can have access to. So anyway, there's actually so many products that are cloud-based products. There's no way I could put them all in here, but here's some of the main things. Now, as far as the licensing and all of that, with Azure, you are paying for what you use, CPU, RAM, storage, and network. But for the Microsoft 365 services, you have what are called subscriptions, and you purchase a subscription with a certain amount of licenses. So, for example, if I purchase a Microsoft 365 subscription, I can purchase a certain amount of licenses, and I can issue those out to my users, and I will pay a monthly fee for however many licenses that I've got with my subscription. Okay, and that's just giving you a basic understanding of how that works exactly. Okay, so ultimately, though, if I could kind of color code this, we'll say that the Azure side of this, IaaS, and again, Azure does have some platform as a service stuff as well as software as a service, but it's mostly geared to be a infrastructure as a service. And then the Microsoft 365 is mostly platform as a service, software as a service. So if I was to kind of draw a, kind of just draw around these, we would say that these right here are all geared towards Microsoft 365, and then these are geared towards the infrastructure service, which is Azure. And both of these, Azure and Microsoft 365, they share Entra ID. They share Entra ID, okay? Yellow or red and blue make purple, right? Okay, so they actually, you create users in the Azure side or the Microsoft 365 side, you're going to see the same users because they are linked together. They share the same directory service, so it's important to understand that. Now, the other piece of this is, what about situations where you want to link all this together? So it's not uncommon nowadays for companies, to have this triangle, to have this on-premise domain, and then also start utilizing Microsoft's cloud services. And then, for years and years, they've always pushed this thing called SSO. SSO is single sign-on, where you have a user has a user account, and that user account gives them access to everything they need. Well, we don't get SSO if you have to have a user account to access things in your domain and then a different user to access things in the cloud, right? Well, Microsoft has ways around that. They actually have services that you can use for linking these together. And that service, let me just kind of move some of this around a little bit so I can make a little bit more room. We'll put the DNS server there. We'll move this little RAS server down over here. And the server is called Microsoft Entra Connect. And it was formerly Azure AD Connect. Okay, so again, it's called Entra Connect now, and it used to be called Azure AD Connect. And I like to refer to it with the old name as well, just because, be advised, you really kind of need to know the old name as well, because there's still a lot of documentation that will refer to this as the older name. The newer name is Entra Connect. The older name is Azure AD Connect. But this was a server you could set up on premise, and what it would do is it'll synchronize your user accounts out to the cloud. So your on-premise user accounts would get synchronized. So whatever users you have on-premise, and you don't have to synchronize them all, you could pick and choose which one you synchronize, but your user accounts are going to sync out to Entra ID. And now what will happen is you have this thing called seamless SSO, where when your users log on to the domain, it logs them on in both places. They log on to the on-premise domain as well as in the cloud, which is really, really cool. Now that is a heavier weight version. There is actually a lighter weight version that's a very, very lightweight application. You don't actually have to dedicate a server to it like they kind of want you to with Connect. There is actually another lighter weight tool called Intra Sync or Entra ID Sync, which is a lighter weight. Now there's some pluses and minuses to go in either route, which I'm not going to get into right now. But the traditional way to do this was to use this here, Intra Connect, formerly Azure AD Connect. Now the other thing I'll tell you is this does not sync back. So it would sync users out, but it won't sync users that are created out in the cloud back to on-premise. You cannot currently do that. You can't synchronize users that are created in Entra ID down here. But any users can be synced out, and it'll even make it where if they change their password, like out in the cloud, it'll sync that as well. So anyway, that kind of gives you a rundown of that. Now, I'll also tell you that Microsoft is moving away from domains. In fact, if you if you got an on-premise domain like what you see here, then yeah, it's a great idea to utilize this. But if you're a new company, and this really pains me to say it because I have fed my family for over 2 decades by not only teaching about Active Directory on-premise, but also implementing Active Directory on-premise as a consultant. And so it kind of pains me to say this, but as a consultant now, I'm not even recommending that newer companies implement a domain anymore. A lot of companies are now moving to the cloud, and there's ups and downs of that. But to be honest with you, in most cases, your company gets out cheaper by utilizing cloud services. Okay. And so nowadays you can actually set up on-premise machines and manage them through Intune and things like that are in the cloud. You can even have client machines hosted in the cloud, but I'm not going to dive into that right now. Ultimately, though, if you are a company that's been around for a while, then the traditional approach that you see here, where you've got a domain, and then you're starting to move into the cloud, you can set up Intra Connect, formerly Azure AD Connect, or Entra ID Sync, and which is the lighter weight version, and you can have things synchronized out to the cloud. All right. Well, hopefully these foundation videos have been instructional to you. I hope you got a lot out of this, and you're ready to move on.
I'd now like to spend a moment trying to help you understand what are the key reasons for using Windows 365. Sometimes people might even ask why we care anything about Windows 365. So I put together 7 key points here that I want to go over with you on why this is such a great solution. The first being accessibility. So when you think about Windows 365 and why this is going to help you in your environment and in today's world, and kind of this is, as you can imagine, where the future is going with Microsoft desktops and all of that. Accessibility plays a big role in this. Basically, you could be anywhere in the world. All you need is a device that can get to the internet, and you can access your Windows desktop, your applications, your data from anywhere. Okay, you could be doing it from a smartphone, a tablet. It could be Mac. It could be Linux. It doesn't have to be a Microsoft-based device in order to access this your Windows environment. Also Android being another one, but ultimately accessibility is a big deal. You can be anywhere in the world, access your desktop, access your data, and you're good to go. The next would be security. Okay, now when we have our Windows 365 desktops, we as admins have central control over that device. And you think about today's world of telecommuting and how a lot of people are, they're working from home, they're working from hotel rooms, they're, in various places. So you can imagine, one of the big problems we've had in the last 10 years, well, really longer than that, is just the fact that a lot of these devices that users are using are not secure, they're not safe. As you might recall, we went from in the late 90s and early 2000s from an environment where the companies would buy devices like laptops, desktops for users and all that. And we, as admins, had complete control over those devices. We could centrally control those devices because the company owned them. And then the world has shifted since smartphones came out. And of course, it's shifted sort of even more when COVID happened in 2020 of people working from home and wanting to work from their own devices. And this whole BYOD thing started, right? Bring your own device. And it meant that, again, a user could be, browsing some of the sketchiest websites on the planet on their device. And then the next minute they could be accessing company resources. So it took a lot of our control out of our hands, because we're no longer in 100% control of those devices. Well, with Windows 365, think about it, the device is hosted in the cloud, so we have the ability to control it. And we can use what are called zero trust principles, which ultimately means that everything gets authenticated. Everything must get authorized. There's no scenario where once a user logs in, they're trusted for the next 90 days or whatever. They're constantly being verified and authenticated. And it's seamless in that they're not constantly getting pop-up messages and things making them re-log in, but it is going through verifications and using what are called security tokens. And if it notices something out of the ordinary, then it can challenge the user. Like, okay, we're going to make you use multi-factor authentication. Something out of the ordinary's happened, and it could require a text message to their phone or the Microsoft Authenticator app and utilize that. So security, of course, is a big part of that. The next is scalability and flexibility. You have resources on demand. Users can be given a certain amount of CPU, certain amount of RAM, certain amount of storage, and if we need to increase that, we can increase that on demand. You think about buying a computer for a user, it's a little harder if they need something more powerful, to upgrade processors and RAM and have all that just done very quickly. Well, with Windows 365, this can happen extremely fast. Then you got simplicity and ease of management. Again, we as IT people can now centrally control these devices. We can very easily have policies and security features in place that's going to be locking things down. We have the ability to deploy these devices very, very easily, or provision these devices, as they like to say, very, very easy to our users. Okay, so not to mention being able to onboard them into different environments, whether it be the Entra ID, formerly known as Azure ID, or whether it be to a Microsoft domain. We've got control of things. It's cost effective. If you think about buying hundreds or even thousands of machines, you're talking big time money, depending upon how much memory and processing power and all of that. And then you've got to, of course, upgrade those machines as time goes on. You've got to deal with all the hardware that involves that. The IT people have to deal with all the issues that goes along with that. Well, with Windows 365, it is a per user per month billing model, which essentially means you pay a certain amount of money. You're going to know how much that money is going out per month. And as people come and go, you can give licenses over to other users, and this can be a very affordable way to do it. Now, you might say, well, what if these people are working in an office? Don't you still need a computer for them? Well, you can use thin clients. If you're not familiar with thin clients, they're very small boxes. They don't have to have a lot of memory, a lot of power. They're relatively inexpensive, and you could place these at users' desks. And these thin clients can, the great thing about it is, too, if you're in an environment where you have customers that come in, like I like to think about doctors' offices and banks and things like that, these thin clients don't know anything. The desktop is hosted in the cloud. So if somebody was to literally steal a thin client from the office and, take it back, there's no data on it. So this is another reason why it plays such a great role as far as security goes. Okay, you have high availability, reliability. Microsoft provides a ton of redundancy when it comes to all of this. So if things go down, you have redundancy. Whereas when a computer is sitting at somebody's desk and the hard drive crashes on it or something like that, you're in trouble unless you've got good backups. So we've got lots of high availability, lots of redundancy there. And the last thing is integration with Microsoft 365. So of course, Windows 365 integrates with the Microsoft 365 services, the various Microsoft 365 apps. And this will include all the advanced analytic data that can be collected, and auditing and monitoring and security, and then as well as giving ease of use to the various apps that Microsoft 365 has to offer. All right. Well, hopefully this video has helped you understand some of the key reasons for why you should use Windows 365. I'd now like to talk about the key differences between Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. There's a lot of people out there that don't quite grasp what the differences are between those two technologies, because there is some similarities, but you're also going to find there is definitely some key differences. And so I want to look at this drawing with you first, and then we're going to go over the key differences, okay? So the first thing here you'll notice in this drawing, let's talk about the key elements of the drawing first. Okay, so first you'll notice we've got an on-premise network here. We've got an on-premise Active Directory known as ADDS, right? You've got a domain controller and all of that. You've got some different types of client machines in the network. And then we've got our actual Microsoft Azure environment. So that's over here. And you can see that this Microsoft Azure environment, they've got a subscription here. And they are also hosting some Active Directory services in the cloud as well, which of course you can link between the on-premise network and the Active Directory network in the cloud if you want, but we don't really need to dive into that. But the key thing I want you to notice is that when it comes to Azure Virtual Desktop, you have pools of virtual machines. That's what you're seeing right here. This is an actual Azure Virtual Desktop pool of virtual machines. And what happens is a user can connect in to this pool and be assigned any one of these available virtual machines. The user's actual profile data and all of that will be stored in a actual storage account that's in Azure. All right. And essentially every time they log on, they may actually get a different virtual machine. So this user might get this virtual machine this time, and the next time they get this virtual machine. But their data is still going to be stored in the storage account. Okay? There's various types of authentications that can occur here. You can authenticate directly to Entra ID, formerly known as Azure AD. You can be using a hybrid setup. You can link to various virtual networks and stuff in there. Keep in mind a lot of that you can do in Windows 365 as well, but you don't have this scalable pool and all of that in Windows 365. Okay, now let's drill into these key differences here. The first thing is the target audience and the use case of all of it. With Windows 365, the goal is to keep things very simple. It's a very simplistic model, subscription service. It's great for small and medium businesses, corporate environments, all of that. Perfect for that type of scenario when it comes to Windows 365. Now, Azure Virtual Desktop is aimed towards larger environments, enterprise-based environments that need extreme amounts of scaling up and down, back and forth. So it's great for that type of scenario. You'll also notice here it says, it's particularly useful environments that need multi-session capabilities and have varied workloads. So various types of things users could be doing, and you need certain services to be turned on and off, all of that. Okay, the next is the pricing model. So with Windows 365, it's a fixed per user, per month pricing model. It's very simple, easy to predict. You're going to know exactly how much money you're paying every month. Now, Azure Virtual Desktop is a consumption-based pricing model. So essentially, you're not going to know how much money you're going to use each month, because it ultimately is going to boil down to the amount of use of those virtual machines. You could save money one month, or you could spend more money in a month. So the cost is going to depend on the resource usage, like your computing processing power, storage, and networking. Okay. The next thing we've got here is the management and deployment. With Windows 365, it's very simple. The deployment process is actually relatively easy and relatively simple. Users can quickly get access to their personal cloud PC without dealing with any kind of crazy, complex configuration that's going to be required as far as admins go. And then Azure Virtual Desktop, of course, is going to give more control over the virtual desktop environment, allowing the IT department to configure, manage, and optimize pretty much all aspects of it. Now, I don't want to get too deep into that, but I will say there's actually quite a bit of control over Windows 365 as well. So there's kind of a fine line on those key points. So then the next point we've got is flexibility and scalability. When it comes to Windows 365, it has a limited customization options compared to AVD, focusing on the ease of management and all that. So again, Windows 365 is meant to be a much simpler model than Azure Virtual Desktop. With Virtual Desktop, you've got lots and lots of customization, tons of scalability, but it's definitely going to be more complex to manage. The next we've got here is application and multi-session support. So generally, with Windows 365, it's going to give you a single session experience where one user accesses their virtual desktop. With Azure Virtual Desktop, going to access their virtual desktop. With Azure Virtual Desktop, you've got a multi-session capability, allowing multiple users to share the same virtual machine. So that is one of the big key differences that I'd like to point out. Users can share the same virtual machines, which can also help reduce cost and improve resource usage. But it also, of course, depending upon how much resource usage you've got, things might have to be, could end up being more expensive in the long run. It just depends on how much resource usage you got, or at least from a standpoint of performance degradation. Then you've got integration and extensibility. Windows 365, it's very seamless. The services are easy to set up, easy to manage. With Azure Virtual Desktop, it's going to integrate with a much wider range of Azure services and third-party tools and all of that. So if you really need a very complex configuration, Azure Virtual Desktop is going to be the way to go. The next thing is, and the last thing really, is the security and compliance. Both services can utilize Microsoft security capabilities, though Azure Virtual Desktop has some more granular controls over security policies and compliance and all that. Windows 365 can also support the security and compliance with some of your industry standards and all that. But again, the ultimate goal of Windows 365 is simplicity. And I think that's the big thing to take away from this video, is that Windows 365 is meant to be a more simplistic, easy to manage, easy to control type of scenario, whereas Azure Virtual Desktop gives you an extreme amount of customizability, but it is going to be more complex to manage. Okay? All right. Well, hopefully that now gives you a better understanding of the difference of Windows 365 versus Azure Virtual Desktop. Let's talk about licensing with Windows 365. Now, it's kind of important to understand licensing if you're going to be putting this in place for a company. As you can probably imagine, you're going to want to have an understanding of that. Now, the first thing I want to say about licensing is that Microsoft can change the way it works at any time. And though I do try to update my videos, don't be surprised sometimes if things might change. And so it's important for you to inspect things on your own. I want to show you how to do that. Before we go in here and configure a license, let's just look at how it works, okay? So the first thing you can do is just go to Google or Bing and just search for the keywords license Windows 365. And you're going to come across this little article right here, and it's going to kind of break down how this is going to work, okay? So if we take a look at that, you have two different tabs. You have a tab called Business and you have a tab called Enterprise. Now, Business, of course, is geared towards the Microsoft 365 business-based subscriptions. It's geared towards businesses that don't have more than about 300 users, and that's the way you want to look at that, all right? There's two different ways of approaching this when it comes to business. You have monthly subscriptions that automatically renew, and then monthly subscriptions with Windows Hybrid Benefit. And you get a 16% discount with the hybrid benefit. So what's the difference? Well, with the monthly subscription, It says automatically renewed. Basically, you are going to get access to Windows 10 and Windows 11, Microsoft Windows 365 desktop with a license that they're providing you. But what if you've got your own license already? If you already have licenses for your Windows operating system, then the hybrid benefit kicks in. And essentially with that, you get a 16% discount. All right, so that's the idea. Now you can see at the creation of this video that these are the current rates of what you're going to get, $32 a month per user for 2 virtual CPUs, 4 gigs of RAM, 64 gigs of storage, and then so on and so forth. You get more storage as you go down the line. And then you two virtual CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM. Here's the storage. Okay. 4 virtual CPUs, 8 virtual CPUs, and you can see it just like I do. And you can always, again, go out there and check this for yourself to see if there's anything that's recently changed. Okay. Now, that's business. Let's look at the enterprise. And this is what a lot of people are using. You got an enterprise-based environment. Maybe you got Microsoft 365 Enterprise like E5 or E3, E5, stuff like that. You might already have a license, and in this case, they will require you to have a subscription that has it included. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if I go over to portal.microsoft.com and I drop down where it says billing, I'm going to click on where it says licenses. And then from there, I should be able to see my subscriptions. Now, let me warn you, you will not probably have the exact same subscriptions as me because I use this for creating various courses. The only one that even matters in this example is this subscription right here, Microsoft 365 E5. So I'm going to click on that. And I have assigned that to John Christopher myself. I'm going to click on John Christopher, and I can see the licenses. And if I scroll down, you'll notice I have this Windows 10/Windows Enterprise license. So that means that my Microsoft 365 E5 subscription gives me a license for Windows 10 and Windows 11. Now, does that mean that I get Windows 365 included with that? Absolutely not. I do not. I have to actually, I'd have to have a license for Windows 365. And I can see what the cost of that's going to be right here, just like I would on business, on the business tab. Okay. So keep that in mind. Now, here's the good news. We can set up a free trial to play around with it for free. So I'm going to go back over here. Okay. Portal.microsoft.com. Go under billing. Go under purchase services. Okay. And then there is a little button where I could do a search for Windows 365. But I'm going to click the little button here called Windows 365. And then right here, Windows 365 Enterprise, I'm going to click Details. And then from there, I can click Select Plan. And there is a try for free plan for this 2 virtual CPU, 8 gigs, 128 gigs. So we're going to go with that. All right. And of course, if you're doing this along with me, you can do the same thing. And then I'm going to click to start free trial. Now, I'm not going to show the screens after the free trial because there is some personal information that I don't want to show on the screen. But that you click the button and then you follow the little wizard, and then at that point, it would be activated. Okay, so I just did that. I just activated my free trial, and I'm going to go under billing, and I'm going to go down to licenses. All right, once I get into licenses, you'll notice that I've got the Windows 365 Enterprise 2 v CPU, all that. I'm going to click on that little subscription, and then at that point, it's going to fetch data. And once it's done fetching data, I'm going to assign licenses. I'm going to assign the license to myself, John Christopher, my little admin account here, and then I'm going to click Assign. And at that point, I have now assigned a license to my user. Now, I also want to point out that before we finish this little video up, that Microsoft will also tell you that you can go to Windows365.com and you can purchase licenses and all that. That way, if you don't have a Microsoft 365 account or any of that stuff, you could actually go through this website to do all of that. Okay. There's also Microsoft partners that you can communicate with on purchasing licenses that some companies use. So there's various ways you can go through it. The way that most companies would go through it, though, that already have their accounts set up, and in our case, I've already set up my account, would be the way that I showed you. Okay. All right. Again, I always encourage you to check out the latest and greatest license information by finding it on the internet like I showed you at the beginning of the video. But hopefully now you have a better understanding of how licensing works with Windows 365. Now I'd like to talk about administering your Windows 365 environment with the help of Microsoft Intune. Now Intune is Microsoft's MDM MAM product. That's mobile device management, mobile application management. If you're not familiar with this, this is sort of where the world has been headed ever since smartphones came out. And part of this is to help deal with the BYOD situation, bring your own device. Nowadays, you have users that carry around Android or iOS-based iPhones in their pocket, tablets, Mac laptops, Linux devices, Windows devices. There's just so many different devices that people carry around or even sit at their desk with, and we need a product that can administer those devices no matter where they're at. Well, that's what Intune is designed for. Okay, and it is going to be your way of centrally managing Windows 365 in an enterprise-based environment. Okay, the first thing to understand, though, is that you have to have the proper licenses, and your users have to have the proper licenses, I should say, if you're going to administer those users. So before we jump into Intune, I want to take a look at those licenses, what those requirements are going to be. So the first thing we need to do here on portal.microsoft.com, we're going to drop down billing. We're going to go here to licenses. Now, you are going to see different licenses than I do. The only one that's going to matter is the Microsoft 365 subscription here. That subscription is going to come with the licenses that we need in our case. If we go here to the user, all right, here is the thing to be aware of. Okay, if I scroll down, let's scroll down and take a look at the licenses. So the first thing to be aware of is you have to have a premium version of Entra ID, formerly known as Azure AD. Okay, either Premium 1 or Premium 2. Now, Microsoft 365 E5 comes with both of these. Okay, so in my case, you've got up to Premium 2 here. That comes with all these advanced features for Entra ID. Okay, there's different versions of Entra ID. There's even a free version. We need at least one of the premiums. So your user will have to have that. The next thing is you must have a Microsoft Intune license, which Microsoft 365 E5 does come with an Intune license. All right. And then finally, of course, if we're using Enterprise, you'd have to have a Windows 10 or 11 Enterprise license, which we do. So the Microsoft 365 E5 comes with all the licenses that are needed for being able to manage a user properly with Intune. Now, if we go over to intune.microsoft.com or endpoint.microsoft.com, this is going to be your main portal for managing your users through Intune. Keep in mind that this portal changes sometimes weekly, so your screen could look a little different than mine. The first thing to be aware of that's really nice, I get this question a lot. Students will ask me, do I need a license for my admins? Well, if your admin is going to be controlled by Intune, yes. But if you just want to administer Intune without a license, then no, you do not have to have a license. But there's something you have to activate if you don't have a license as an admin. Now, I am an admin and I do have a license, so I'm good to go. But if I did not, I can go right here to Tenant Administration. All right, and then I'm going to go to Roles, and then there is a blade called Administrator Licensing. I can click on that. Then there's a little button that I could click on that would allow unlicensed admins to access Intune. Of course, in my case, again, I already have the rights to do it. Okay, so I don't have to do that. Now, if I look over here, you'll see the various blades. The main blade I want to talk about right now is devices. And this, of course, is going to allow me to see my various operating system platforms and all of that if I had devices that were enrolled. and I can click on the one I care about for this video, which is Windows 365. And this, of course, is going to be the main area where we can see what is called device onboarding of our Windows 365 devices, which, of course, right now, I don't have any devices. I have not provisioned any devices, okay? And I'm not going to dive deep into what all these tabs mean in this video. I just wanted to kind of show you around a little bit. But this is where device onboarding is going to be, and this is where you got to understand that I'm going to be able to provision a Windows 365 device out to my users if I want, okay? Another thing I want to quickly point out is that we have this thing called the configuration blade. These are called configuration policies, also known as configuration profiles. This is one of the most powerful features and capabilities that we have for controlling our devices with Intune. With this, I can create this thing called a new policy or configuration profile. I can base it on a platform like Windows 10 or later, and then I can do this thing called settings catalog or templates. Not going to dive deep into the difference, but ultimately you'll have the same features, just a different way of approaching it. But I can create this policy, okay, and I can go through and I can set hundreds and hundreds of settings on somebody's device. Now, this is just the categories, but there are hundreds and hundreds of settings. Now, some of you who coming from the on-premise world of Windows might be familiar with something called a GPO, a group policy object. Well, this is the equivalent of that. It's the one beautiful thing about it is Windows GPOs, group policy objects, in the on-premise network with Active Directory only work for Windows devices. These types of profiles can be deployed to all the various operating systems that you just saw right here. Okay, see that? Very awesome, very cool. Now, the other thing we got that I want to mention in this video briefly, this is just an overview, is compliance policies. So you can have what are called compliance policies that will require certain compliance rules to be in place on the device, certain compliance criteria to be in place on the device, or the device can be marked not compliant, and restrictions can be placed when those requirements are not met. Okay, so I could require that you have to have a certain update to the operating system. I could require antivirus must be enabled. The firewall's got to be enabled and blocking certain things. I could have all that as a requirement, and if your device does not meet all those requirements, then you are not compliant, and then I can decide, I can have rules that are put in place on what to do with you. The next and last thing I want to mention here is conditional access policy. As far as security goes, conditional access policies, this is another type of policy you can put in place that focuses on the entryway to access resources in your Microsoft 365 environment. So on top of compliance policies, I can have it take other actions and do other types of checks on your device to make sure that certain criteria is met. And if you're not meeting that criteria, well, you just get blocked altogether. For example, I can make it where when you go to check your email, you must be using the official Microsoft Outlook app on whatever type of device it is. If you're using some no-name mail client like Monkey Mail or something, the Monkey Mail app, then that is not on our list of approved apps. So you would not be able to check your email. Okay, I could have conditional access policies block you. And that's, again, this is just an overview, not doing a deep dive into that, but that's a very powerful capability as well. Okay, and then finally, we can deploy scripts out to devices. We can do updates and manage updates for some of the different operating systems. There's just a lot you can do. Microsoft Intune is an incredibly powerful product, okay? All right, and it is, I do have a whole entire course on that if you are interested, okay? But this course is not going to be a deep dive in Intune, but we are going to get into the things you need to know in regards to Windows 365. Now, in all the different areas of Azure and Microsoft 365, in order for someone to administer those various areas and the various resources and services that we have to have permission. And permissions are going to be managed through what's called RBAC, Role-Based Access Control. Windows 365 is no different. We have to have permissions in order to administer it. If we want to delegate out tasks to other various admins, we have to be able to do that with the help of roles. So I want to spend some time helping you understand the role access that's going to be needed in order for managing resources involving Windows 365. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you that you can do is you can go out to Google or Bing and just search for the keywords Windows 365 role-based access, and from there you'll find this article right here talking about Cloud PC role-based access control. Now, the first role of note is a role called Windows 365 Administrator role. And basically, this is what you would give an admin if you wanted to give them the ability to administer Windows 365, but you don't necessarily want to give them, as I like to say, the keys to the kingdom. So what's the keys to the kingdom? Well, that is a role called the Global Admin role. A Global Administrator already has the keys to the kingdom, if you will. They can administer anything and everything involving Microsoft Entra ID, formerly known as Azure AD. Okay? Now, we don't want, maybe we have a person that works at our organization and that is their full-time job is managing Windows 365 for us. We don't want to give them the keys to the kingdom. We don't want to make them a global admin, so we would give them this role right here. So where do we find this role? Well, if we visit portal.azure.com, I'm going to click the little menu button here, go to Microsoft Entra ID. I'm going to go down and go to Roles and Administrators, and so this is where our main intro roles are located. If we scroll down, we should be able to find the Windows 365 Administrator. So if I wanted to, with that, I could click on that role, and then I could click Add Assignment, and I could then assign that role over to a user. Okay, remember that I already am a global administrator. Okay, so I don't necessarily have to do that because, as I like to say, I have intergalactic cosmic powers over Microsoft Entra ID as it is. But I could, if I wanted to delegate this role over to somebody else, I could and give that power to them without giving them, like I say, the keys to the kingdom. Okay, so that is the first role I'd like to point out when it comes to Windows 365. The next role that we've got is called a Cloud PC Administrator. This allows somebody to just be able to manage operating system image management, Azure network connection configuration. That means they can deal with connecting Windows 365 PCs to the Azure environment. And they're also allowed to do provisioning, so they can work with what are called provisioning policies and all that for provisioning out machines to users. But that is the extent of what they have. And then you've also got the Cloud PC Reader role, and this is going to give users the ability to be able to read anything and everything involving Cloud PCs, but they cannot necessarily do any of these tasks here, and they are not a full-blown administrator like up here, okay, with that role. And then finally, you have what's called Windows 365 Network Interface Contributor. This is a role that is assigned to a resource itself, and it'll be utilized for allowing your Windows 365 service to create and join what are called virtual NICs to a resource group in Azure, which I'm not going to dive deep into that right now. Really wouldn't stress a lot over this one right now, okay? It does mention some of the different actions that get associated with these. You have what's called a Windows 365 Network User role as well, and the idea here is it's assigned to your virtual network associated with your Azure network connections. I'm not going to dive deep into that right now either. This is a role that you'll be utilizing whenever you need to connect Windows 365 devices, PCs, to Azure virtual networks. Now, what really the main point of this video is to get across these three right here. The Windows 365 Administrator role, which I've already shown you, and then these two right here. Now, here's the problem. Cloud PC Administrator and Cloud PC Reader. If I go back to Azure right now, back into my portal.azure.com, my Entra ID, and then go to Roles, let's see if we can find the Cloud PCs, Cloud PC Administrator. Well, if you look down, there's no Cloud PC Administrator. There's a Cloud Device Administrator, but that's not actually the same thing. In fact, if you click on that, click Description, it tells you This is for enabling, disabling, deleting devices in Microsoft Entra ID. It doesn't mention anything involving Windows 365. Well, in order to find this role, we actually have to go into Microsoft Intune. So let's go into intune.microsoft.com. We're going to click on Devices. We're going to click on Tenant Administrator. All right. We're going to then go to Roles. And this is where you're going to find it. So we'll scroll down. And there we go. There's our Cloud PC Administrator. And then there's our Cloud PC Reader. And so we can click on Cloud PC Administrator if we want. Go to Properties. All right, shows you some of the permissions and stuff that it's going to have. And then if I want to do an assignment, I can click on Assignments. And then I can assign this role to whoever I want. Okay, so I could create a group, and then I could assign it to a specific group if I wanted to. All right, and the way I would do that, I'd just give it a name. I'd click Next, assign the group, and there you go. Now, keep in mind, I am a global administrator. I already have all this power, but if I wanted to pass it over to somebody else, this is the way I could go about doing that. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully now with this video, you have a better understanding of the role-based access control. In other words, giving out permissions to your users that perhaps are going to be assisting you. Maybe these are junior level admins, or maybe they're dedicated admins. But again, we are global admins. We've got all the power in the world when it comes to all this. But if we wanted to delegate out rights to somebody else, this is the way we'd go about doing it. Now, ultimately, what I want to do is I would like to provision a Windows 365 PC out to my user account. But in order to do that, I'm going to need a group, and that user is going to have to be a member of that group. So in this video, what I want to do is go ahead and create the group and explain how all that's going to work before we go in and provision the Windows 365 PC out to the user. All right. So here we are on intune.microsoft.com, and keep in mind, where you create this group really doesn't matter. You can create it here. You can create it in portal.microsoft.com. Which is the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. You could create in the Azure portal, which is portal.azure.com. You could create it in the Intra portal, intra.microsoft.com. There's so many different places you could do this. It does not matter as long as you get access to this blade called Groups. So here we are on intune.microsoft.com. We're going to click Groups. Keep in mind, you will not have the same groups as I have in this example. Again, remember that that I have had to create with this tenant. I've had to create various courses and all of that. Microsoft doesn't allow me to keep creating free tenants every time I want to build a course, so I have to use the same one. Ultimately, though, I can click right here to create a new group. All right, and this is going to ask me what kind of group I want this to be. Do I want it to be a security group, or do I want it to be a Microsoft 365 group? Okay, so this is going to be a security group. Security groups are groups that can be assigned and given permissions and special rights to things. Security groups do not get a Exchange mailbox. They don't get a shared calendar with Exchange. They don't get a Microsoft Team. They don't get a Microsoft SharePoint site. They are generally used to just give out rights to things, which is what we're giving rights to this device in this case. The other thing is that security groups one of the biggest benefits to a security group in Microsoft 365 is that you can control devices with a security group. So yes, you can put users in there. Yes, you can put devices in there, and you can control those devices with the security group. You cannot do that with a Microsoft 365 group, only a security group. Microsoft 365 group can only contain users. Now in this case, though, we are going to put a user in the security group because we want to apply this provision right over to a user, but you're going to need a group to do that. We're going to call this group Windows 365. In this case, we're going to provision this to go to Entra ID, so it'll happen through Entra ID. We're not going to involve a on-premise domain, so I'm going to put Entra ID. All right, and that's going to be the name of this group. You could spread that out with some dashes if you wanted, make it a little easier to read. but we'll just leave it at that. All right. And then it says Microsoft Entra roles can be assigned. I don't need to give it any special roles here. Do I want this to be a assigned role, membership type, dynamic user, or dynamic device? So if you don't know the difference there, a assigned group is the traditional type of group where you manually put people in the group. You manually put users in or manually put devices in as an admin. Now you can also designate an owner. This person does not have to be an admin, but they will have the right to add people and remove people out of the group. Now, you can also go with what's called a dynamic user or dynamic device. You can only do dynamic device if this is a security group. If it's a Microsoft 365 group, you won't have that option. But anyway, if I choose dynamic user, I can do this thing called a dynamic query, where it will base membership of the group not by you manually adding or removing people. In fact, you cannot manually add or remove people to the group if you do this. But if I do that, I can add these things called expressions, and your membership will be based on what my expression says. So for example, I could go here and say choose a property, and I could base the property off department, and I could say, let's say the department attribute for the user, let's say either equals or is equal to or contains any of the following words. And I could say like sales. So at that point, anybody who has sales as their department attribute would get added to this group. Keep in mind that is not case sensitive either. Okay. And you can have other expressions as well. So I could do department, and I could say, or if the, let's say, job title has any of the following. If the job title contains the word sales, then it would do it. So either department or job title, and then it would add the user to the group. Okay. So that is what dynamic membership rules are. I'm going to discard that. Now again, if I wanted to add a device, which I don't, I want to add a user, but if I was going to do a device, you'll have different query strings for that. I can do really interesting things there, like I can say device operating system type, operating system version category. With like device operating system type, I could base it on Apple, Android, I could do iOS, iPad OS. Pretty neat. All right, but in our case, we're going to go with assigned. All right, and I could specify who the owner is going to be. So if I wanted to specify somebody like myself as the owner, I could do that. Keep in mind you won't have the exact same users as me if you're doing this with me. But I'm actually going to put myself as a member as well, because I'm going to deploy this out to me. So we'll go there, John Christopher, we'll click select, we'll click create. And at that point, we now have our group. Okay, this Windows 365 group. If I search for that, there it is. I should be able to see that I am a member. And so there you go. We got our group created. We got our member in the group. And with that, we've now got the group we need for provisioning. I now want to go through the process of provisioning a Windows 365 PC out to my user who is part of a group that I've created, and I am going to make it where this PC is going to auto-join our Entra ID environment. Remember that Entra ID is formerly known as Azure AD. Okay, so here I am on intune.microsoft.com. Okay, from there we're going to click on the devices blade. We're going to scroll down. We're going to go to Windows 365. And then we're going to click on provisioning policies. And so a provisioning policy is going to be an object that's created in Intune that's basically going to set everything in motion for provisioning this device. So I'm going to go ahead and click to create the policy. Okay. And then from there, we're going to give this a name. So we can call this Windows 365 group Entra ID group provision, and that's what we're going to call it. Okay, and then from there we could give it a description if we wanted, and the license type. So what are we going for? Enterprise in our case, but what is frontline? So if you're not sure about frontline, They have a nice little article here that we can check out. And they tell us that the idea of Frontline, it's designed for people that don't need 24/7 access to a dedicated cloud PC. They tell you it's better supports optimizations and are more elastic, distributed. They work across various devices. These are people, Frontline are people that are on the go. They're not sitting at the same place, the same desk all the time. They do tell you the maximum number of active Windows 365 Frontline Cloud PC sessions in your organization is equal to the number of licenses, Frontline licenses, that you've purchased. Now, it also tells you that a user that's going to be using this must have Windows 11 Enterprise, Windows 10 Enterprise license, Intune, and then at least a Premium 1, or it can be Premium 2 based license, okay? And then in addition, you have all these other possible ones that are included as well. It says in addition to being available independently, Windows Enterprise, Intune, and Microsoft Entra ID are also included as part of these subscriptions. Okay, anyway, we're not doing Frontline, but I did want to kind of chase that rabbit for a second with you, make sure you are clear on what that was. We're doing Enterprise. The next thing is, what are we joining? Are we just joining Entra, or are we doing a hybrid? Now, Entra is what I'm doing in this video here, and the idea is it's going to join into Entra ID, remember formerly known as Azure AD. It's not going to be part of a hybrid here in this case. It's just going to be part of Entra, okay? So you're not part, in other words, this device will not be currently part of a Microsoft domain. A hybrid environment includes Active Directory Domain Services, also known as ADDS. Remember, the on-premise version of Active Directory is still called Active Directory. It did not get renamed like Azure AD did when Azure AD got renamed to Entra, okay? So just be aware of that. If we did have an on-premise domain and we wanted it to join Entra, and then the device would be synchronized to the on-premise domain, we would choose the second option. But in this case, I don't want to do that. The next thing is the network. What are we doing as far as network? Now, I'm going to go with, in this case, Microsoft hosted network. That means it's a network that will be hosted in Azure, but it's not linked to any specific Azure virtual network, what is called a VNet and all of that. So it's a Microsoft hosted network. It does link in regards to Azure, but it's not going to be part of any kind of virtual networks, VNets, or any of that, okay? In this case, I'm not really diving deep into VNets in this video either, just so you know. So we're going to go with the Microsoft hosted network. Then it wants to know the geography. In my case, I'm going to go right here and I'm going to say United States East, and I'm going to choose East US. Okay, so that's the region that this is in. The other thing is, do you want to use Microsoft Entra single sign-in? Now, what that essentially means is that when you sign into the device, it's going to authenticate you not just to the device, it's going to authenticate you with Entra ID as well as the Microsoft 365 services and all of that. So yes, I do want that. Okay, and of course you can learn more about that if you click the little eye symbol that brings you into the little article here, and they get more into the idea of authentication. So right here. So Windows 365 offers single sign-on, defined as a single authentication prompt that can satisfy both the Windows 365 service authentication and Cloud PC authentication. There you go. So that's fine. We're going to click Next. Then the image type. So what kind of image do I want? And in my case, I'm going to go with this Windows 11 Enterprise plus the Microsoft 365 apps, the newest version. And in your case, you might have different versions available. I'm just going to go with the latest version that includes the Microsoft 365 apps. You can also set up what's called a custom image, which I'm not getting into in this video, but you can do a custom image. You can learn more about this right here. If you go to their this little page here, it even talks about setting up a custom image. You can upload up to 20 of your own custom device images. So they do get into that there. You can get into the setup of all of it, but again, I'm not diving into that in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Okay, language and region, I'm going to do English United States. Cloud PC naming. So I am going to name the Cloud PC, and they give you an example of what kind of naming convention to use here. So I'm going to put, in my case, ELP, which is Exam Lab Practice, I'm going to put a dash, and then the next thing I'm going to do is put the first 5 characters of the user's name. So I'm going to say %username : 5%. So it's going to take the first 5 characters of the user's name, and then that'll be the next part of it. Now, I cannot stop here because I got to have some randomization in here, because what if you had, 2 users that have the name John, or, whatever, Johnny, something that, you'd end up with a conflict. So we'll say dash, and we'll say %rand : 5%. So what that's going to do is it's going to tag a randomized 5-digit number on the end of that, and that's good. So I'm going to leave it at that. Then the next thing is, do I want to add additional services? Okay, they do tell me that my subscription includes some additional services. Ultimately, the main additional service that it offers is what's called Windows Auto Patch. And if you look right here, it says Windows Auto Patch cannot be managed your cloud PC until a global admin has finished setting it up. And you have to go through a process of setting up this auto patch feature, which I'm not getting into in this video right now. There is a Learn More article about that, enabling all that, but again, I'm not getting into that in this video. So we're going to say none, and then I'm going to click next, and then this is where I have to assign my group that I've created. So I've created a group already. I'm going to click Add Groups, and we're going to put Windows 365. Here it is right here, Entra ID. We're going to click Select. At that point, we're going to click Next, and then we're going to go ahead and click to Create. So this is going to get created, and I will warn you that it can take about 30 minutes before the actual PC is available to your user. So keep in mind that before you're going to be able to connect in and see anything, you may have to wait about 30 minutes, okay? But with that, that is everything I did want to show you in this video. We've now got our provisioning policy set up, and we do, of course, have to wait before we can utilize this, but that's what I wanted to get into in this video. Hopefully all that made sense. Now, when it comes to accessing your Windows 365 PC as a client, there are various options that are available. First off, you can find this article if you actually go out there and just search the keywords Windows 365 clients. You'll see an article called Access a Cloud PC. You can do that off Google or Bing, and that's going to be this article right here. And they have this nice little table. They tell you that depending upon which version of Windows 365 you're going for, you've got the Business 365, Windows 365 Enterprise, Windows 365 Frontline, and then from there are essentially 4 different options at the creation of this video that involves how you would connect. One would be the Windows 365 app, and they tell you that this is going to be available. All 3 of these are available with that app. There's also Windows365.Microsoft.com, which is a web portal. These are all available for that. You have the Microsoft Remote Desktop, so that will get you into these 2, but not Frontline. And then the LG Web OS, which will get you into these 2 as well. All right. So as far as the Windows app goes, this is kind of what it looks like. All right. You can see it's an app inside the store. You download and you make your connection. Okay. And then, of course, they do tell you that, as far as like user actions and all that goes, once you connect, you have the ability to do a restart, a reset, a rename. So you change the name of the PC, reset will reinstall Windows, removes your personal files, removes any changes, removes the apps. You can restart it. You can also use troubleshooting, like a little troubleshooters to help you fix issues. There's a dark mode option. The web client, you can do the web client, which again, that's going to be Windows365.Microsoft.com, and from there you'll select the device and features on the physical device that you want to be able to do. You can do printer mapping, which will make it where you can, through the web client, you can map back to your local printer and print. Your microphone as well, your clipboard, you can copy and paste between the 2. And then they've also got this location feature as well, which will redirect, lets your cloud PCs access approximate locations, safety without privacy concerns, and all that. So essentially, your PC will use the location of your physical device as close as it can get to it. And so therefore, it'll display things like if you've got the weather and all of that, it's going to try to detect all of that based on the location where you're at. Okay, so that's how that works. There'll be a little bar for you to play around with. I'm not diving too deep into that in this video, just because we can connect into it in a bit. But so that's going to be how that's going to work. You've also got the LG WebOS option. This is Windows 365 web client. If you got an LG TV with the latest WebOS 23, you have access to all these capabilities with that. And then the remote desktop, you have the remote desktop client, and they even give you a list of which operating systems that the remote desktop client comes with. If you're not familiar with that, a remote desktop's been around for many, many, many years. So this is probably not a big surprise that's available. But just remember, based on their table, that with these two, you're not going to be able to do that as a frontline worker. But you can do it with the app, and you can do the frontline worker with the Windows365.microsoft.com. Okay. All right, well, and that's the point of this video. I just wanted to kind of talk about the clients before jumping in and actually trying this out. Now, after you have actually created a provisioning policy in Microsoft Intune, you got to wait a while, probably about 30 minutes or so, give or take. You now can go and verify that you have Windows 365 PCs that have been provisioned. And I want to show you how to do that. And this is something you'd want to make sure you've done before trying to connect to your Windows 365 PCs or any of that. You just want to verify that a device has been provisioned. I also want to point out that this would be a troubleshooting step if you had a situation where a user was saying that they are not able to find their provisioned machine. So here I am on intune.microsoft.com. I'm going to click on Devices. Then we're going to go down here to Windows 365, and we should be able to go right here to where it says All PCs, and you can see right here. So you can tell that I have had a device that has been provisioned. It says ELP-JC, and then it's got this random 5-digit code here at the end. All right, so that would be my provision device that has been provisioned to my user account. You can click on that provision device as well and see more information about the device itself. So you can see that the primary user here, John Christopher. You can see the properties of the device. You've got some performance information, talks about hardware, discovered apps, device compliance, configuration. Keep in mind that's when you start getting into deploying compliance policies and configuration profiles and what are called app configuration. You can deal with the local admin password. This is if you're implementing something called LAPS, which I'm not getting into in this video. You got user experience information here. This gets into gathering analytics on things like the startup performance, application reliability, and resource performance. There's just a lot here. Again, not digging into all of this stuff right now, but I did want to point that out. Ultimately, the key thing I wanted to get across in this video was just to show you that we can verify that a device has been provisioned to a user. And we can do that, again, by going to Devices, Windows 365, clicking on All PCs here, and you can see right there that this device has been provisioned out to a user.
Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, and I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.